over, and more needs to be done. Wildlife trafficking is a serious organized crime, often compounded by the existence of corruption and the existence of money laundering in a big way. And like other types of organized crime, such as the trafficking of other illicit commodities and people smuggling, it is a threat to good governance, a threat to sustainable development, and in some cases also a threat to national or regional security. And as such, it calls for a strategic and coordinated response. Unambiguous legislation, persistent law enforcement, and coordinated action along the entire wildlife trafficking value chain, and value chain under inverted commas here, including tackling demand and sustainable world. This is why I'm pleased to see that we're actually more in demand than ever these days. And in particular in the context also of the Africa-European Union Strategic Partnership, the European Union supports security and development in Africa through a number of flagship projects funded via the Pan-African program. And this support here from the European Union also comes from a Pan-African angle from our facility. And in this context, it is in this context that the ENACT program is being supported. And this particular seminar is also aligned to the European Union Action Plan against wildlife trafficking and the African Union Strategy against wildlife trafficking. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more of that in the course of today. The project aims, and I hope it will succeed, to increase the effectiveness of the fight against organized crime on the African continent, which of course includes wildlife trafficking. Now, today's objective is to find out what has worked well, where the gaps are, and what has changed in the modus operandi of the criminal networks, and how expertise from other fields in fighting organized crime can help to address this challenge. With all of that, I wish us a successful day and, of course, success into the anti-rhino and anti-wildlife trafficking activities. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador Koinara. It's really great to have you, and we are so grateful for the EU support in this program. And if I didn't mention before, ENACT is a consortium led by the ISS with our partners Interpol and the Global Initiative Against Organized Crime in Geneva. So without further ado, Nelson Asula, my colleague, senior researcher on our team, is our chair, and will take it away.
Thank you very much, all of you. I would like to start by introducing our panelists this morning, who are highly distinguished researchers in the area of transnational organized crime, and in this case on issues to do with poaching. And on my immediate second left is Kira Okan, who is a researcher with the NACT program at the ISS, as she has introduced herself. She's also a co-author of the paper that we are launching today that focuses on organized crime in terms of wildlife crimes in Southern Africa. And followed by her, next to her is Christopher Carlson, who is a senior researcher from Small Arms Survey. He's a research institution based in Geneva, Switzerland, but he is currently working out of Kenya, Nairobi. Lastly, but not least, is Mr. Kapua Ogen, who is a research coordinator from the Center for Natural Resource Governance in Zimbabwe. And that brings us to a very important topic of today, the topic of poaching. In general, wildlife crimes, which is a transnational organized crime. And before you go into that, a small quiz for you, the audience. Which denomination of the rand carries the rhino head? Get the answer at the end of this. I would like to start first by posing a question to Kira, who has done a very, very innovative piece of research. The paper that we are launching today is quite innovative in that it sets a ground for new, innovative ways of relooking into this issue. that has been very persistent, that is a threat to our wildlife across the board, and therefore she has come up with certain perspectives that are really enriching the debate, and that from there we are going to brainstorm further in terms of how do we take this forward. My two other colleagues have equally done very, very interesting work in the area of poaching and wildlife crimes in general, and we'll be following on also with those issues. First of all, Kira, if we could start with you, could you kindly briefly tell us about your research, how you went about it, and some of the gaps that you have come up with?
Sure. Great, thanks, Nelson. Yes, I think you gave maybe too much praise there. The paper that we're launching today is actually on a new pilot program on kind of incident monitoring, we're calling it. So it's a TOC incident monitoring project. And basically what we're doing is following the model kind of put out by conflict data programs that basically have used media monitoring to create discrete points of data on conflict incidents. So in the case of conflict actors, what this means is a news article provides information on who was involved, where it happened, the nature of the altercation, how many people were killed. And from that, researchers have been able to get a more nuanced understanding of conflicts around Africa and elsewhere. And we thought here in ISS, kind of it started in the Africans, in our institution, AFI, here, and myself and Zach and Yaki Saliers together all came up with this kind of methodology of how can we apply a similar model to organized crime. Is it possible to get the same level of nuance from the media that you can with conflict for organized crime? So this report today that we're launching, myself and Zach unfortunately can't be here today, he's in Namibia launching another paper. We're very pleased to release this, and glad to be joined by some of the researchers from the University of Pretoria that have worked closely with us on it. And so it's basically a pilot, and what we did in this paper is try to show the methodology in kind of detail, to be quite open and to really show how much we want this to be a collaborative effort, and we want to build it and grow it. Because there are limitations to what we can get from media analysis, but there's also a lot that we learned in the process, and it became a really great platform to ask other questions, and it led to more things we want to research, and we have tons of side projects we now want to lead from it, and I think that's why we put today together to really start to help us think critically around what we learned. And are we doing what we set out to do? We noticed a gap in some of the data around in between poaching and smuggling, right? Those are the two dominant areas that we seem to know about in terms of data and statistics. And we sought to ask, okay, well, what about the rest of it? What about the nature of the groups? What about the violence against poachers, or the types of arms that are used and the weaponry? And these are the types of things we started to look at, and we had some interesting insights. So with that, I'll respond to questions as they come. But yes, that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Thanks, Kira. Could I request Christopher, who has worked extensively on the issue of arms, ammunition, and poaching, is currently involved in very innovative research in terms of tracking, linking the gun to the poacher, to the origin, to the source. And maybe just briefly, as you introduce yourself, talk about that as well.
Well, thanks, Nelson, for the introduction. And on behalf of the Small Arms Survey, also appreciate very much the invitation to be a part of today's discussions. So thank you to the Institute for Security Studies for that. The Small Arms Survey is a Geneva-based organization. We conduct evidence-based research, policy-relevant research on a range of issues concerning small arms and light weapons and armed conflict. In the African continent, we work closely with regional economic communities, with states, in trying to help them implement various aspects of the UN Program of Action on Small Arms. And the Program of Action has to do with the eradication of the proliferation of illicit weapons. So this includes helping states strengthen national legislation on firearms, export and import control improvements, helping states think through more strategically in terms of how to manage their own weapons to prevent the diversion of those weapons into civilian hands. Also looking at issues concerning civilian firearms and record keeping, the registration of firearms, the management of that type of data so that these records are easily accessible should there be reason to investigate stolen or found weapons at crime scenes and so forth. We also conduct large national household assessments. These are our small arms assessments. We've recently done this in Somalia and South Sudan. These are projects trying to capture public perceptions around formal security provision, why, how, and from where are people sourcing their weapons, as well as looking at victimization. What types of violence are people experiencing, whether it's involving firearms or other types of crime. More kind of sliding into the realm of what we're doing in terms of poaching is that we do a lot of work in tracking and looking at illicit weapons flows. We're currently engaged in a project with the African Union as part of their Silencing the Gun initiative, in looking at kind of mapping out and getting a better understanding of where illicit weapons are coming into the continent and what some of those trafficking routes are inside of Africa, from country to country or within countries themselves. And so what we've done a lot in the past has a lot to do with armed conflict. A lot of the work we've done is in countries such as Syria, looking at Libya, looking at where weapons are fanning outward from these conflicts or where they're going into those conflict areas. And so trying to get a sense of the types of weapons, but also trying to take a closer look at the individual weapons types to understand the chains of custody, if you will, of where those weapons are coming from and where they're passing through on their way to these conflict areas. And then, of course, in the situation of Libya, the situation is very different, where these weapons are flowing outward. And so there's a lot of poaching activity that's going on in Central African states, of course. And so the interest for us and the interest for me is looking at how can our methodologies, those that we use within these contexts of armed conflict, how can we adapt those and use those within a poaching context? And so there's a lot of similarity there, and there's some easy avenues through which we can kind of use both of these methods or use some of those methods in both of these contexts to gain a better understanding of the types of weapons that are going into poaching areas, the types of weapons that poachers are using, and to try to better understand how those weapons are coming into the possession of poachers. And it's also true of ammunition, which is also part of the same type of methodology in terms of looking at the markings of these types of things, to try to better understand where they're being sourced and try to assist states, again, going back to the UN Program of Action, how they can shore up some of those areas where they may need to strengthen those internal weapons and ammunition control mechanisms to better mitigate the consequences of what these weapons are doing in terms of poaching, the impacts that they're having at many different levels, certainly here in South Africa and elsewhere across the continent. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to providing a few more details concerning this work.
Yes, thanks. It's interesting that all this is happening when the United Nations has put in place certain instruments to regulate the export of weapons, the end user certification, and all these issues. And yet we still have an aggravating situation where we have increased poaching cases and all that, in which arms are a central weapon of use. The Arms Trade Treaty, for example, the United Nations Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, how effective are these instruments? Some of those are issues that we need to engage in at a later stage, perhaps, and try and evaluate the effectiveness. And next, I think, is Mr. Tapua, who is from Zimbabwe and is very much hands-on in terms of tracking issues of wildlife crime. He works very intensively within the country in Zimbabwe, but also widely across the continent. I think this is the second time we are meeting this year in this kind of forum. Thank you, Mr. Tapua. Please.
Good morning, everyone. I will start. My name is Tapua Ubanachi. I work with the Center for Natural Resource Governance, Zimbabwe. What we basically do is we use what is known as research-based advocacy, which means the advocacy that we do is based on evidence. So we are also working within the extractive sector in line with wildlife crime. We have seen that the expansion of, I'll give an example of coal mines or exploration of coal is actually destroying animal habitats, which makes it easier for poachers to be able to kill these animals and sell, because we have realized that people will be focusing more on the minerals that is going to be extracted and less on the wildlife issues. We've done an environmental impact assessment on Mwangi coal mining, which actually brought some of the results that we never anticipated, whereby the villagers within the circle are complaining that the animals or the elephants within that area, they are dwindling and they don't know what is happening to them. So we have basically recovered. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get a quotation from Dr. Neil Cruz, who said that wildlife trade is an illegal, big, complex, and dirty business. The part that I'm going to quote is the complex. We have seen that it's not an easy way to research wildlife crime because a number of actors are involved. There's big money involved, and I think from Kiera's paper, it's between 12 and 20 billion dollars that is involved worldwide in this whole business. Which means whenever there's money involved, it's easier for those with the money to actually work or make sure that they manage to get whatever they want. Also, we can focus on the elephants, we can focus on the rhinos, but there are a number of animals which are involved. We can talk of the African grey parrot, we can talk of lion, we can also talk of tortoises. There's actually illegal trade in tortoises. So there's a number of animals who are involved in this wildlife trade. Also, from a research perspective, we've got a number of statistics that have been thrown all over the show, which are basically dwindling. What is baffling is, I'll give you a quotation. I'll give you a very good example, whereby in Zimbabwe, we are talking of the country having lost 220 million to wildlife poaching. That is between 2000 and 2014. And now, we also need to challenge or check how they come up with that value. Because when you talk of poaching, and what value is from the money, because when you talk of poaching, it's going to be very difficult to know what number of animals have been poached and what type of animals been poached. So basically what we are saying is wildlife crime is a very complicated, interconnected. He's been talking of small arms. You can't kill an elephant with bare hands. It means you need to have something that is very effective to kill an elephant. Like in Zimbabwe, we've just discovered that they are now using cyanide because the poachers don't want to be held using a gunshot. So they're using innovative ways of killing. But when you put cyanide in a pond, you're not only killing elephants, you're killing the elephants and their calves and anything else that drink from that pond. So this is how complex the method is. I think we'll be talking more as we progress.
Well, thank you. I think Tapua opens up a very interesting perspective, which is also reflected in Kira's paper, that we might easily be blinded by the wildlife that is facing extinction, like elephants, like rhinos, and forget the other aspects of wildlife. And that's a very dangerous way to take. And Kira, in your research paper, you actually focus on that as well. You touch on the issues of one needing to look at the wider perspective of wildlife crimes in general. How did you go about this in terms of your methodology, and what are some of the challenges that you experienced, and how do you intend to take that forward?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's true. What we learned is in using the media monitoring as the kind of key platform. So what this involves is a keyword search of words around trafficking and specific animal types that the coders would use routinely on a daily basis. So it's a systematic daily monitoring of what's reported in the media, both international media and local media. And what you're able to get from that is two things. You can get a picture or a vague picture of a situation, but you also get a picture of what the media is doing, what the media is tracking, what is getting into the news. And so we had to square that, is what is actual factual, what is real, versus what is the media chasing because it's something like Rhino, it's appealing, it's what people want to talk about. And we did find, interestingly, that rhinos was unsurprisingly one of the most. We found the most incidents related to rhino horn, elephant, of course, but it also teased out new things that we grappled with. This increasing trade in donkey hides, and how do we classify that, given it's not covered by CITES? Things along pangolin and abalone, interestingly, in the connections in the Cape with tick and drug networks. It brought out all of these things that we're hearing in the qualitative literature by the big NGOs that work in this space. But what we got is kind of piecemeal incidents. We could actually track names. We could track the times that someone was quoted in a litigation case. We could follow that up if we needed to. So I think what we face in terms of the biggest challenge is probably that. What is what is reflective of the media's sensationalism, possibly, or following of big issues versus what's factual. And I think we, as a team of researchers, have been able to kind of sit and approach those issues and actually change and modify the methodology as we needed. But I think just that. I think, you know, following new trends is what it also showed us. We picked up a lot of the cyanide poisoning in Zimbabwe, and we see that's still increasing because this project's obviously continuing, and cyanide we see was recently used in Hwange again. And so in a way we can use it both as a soundboard to do further research, or we can use it as a way to pick evidence out of, or to be evidence for existing qualitative reports. You know, and we have this database that can be used for more research now. You know, if you take Traffic's new report on the kind of domestic market for ivory, that Julian will probably speak a bit about more later, what we're able to do is actually go through the database and search for the word jewelry and ornaments and see how many times we picked up on media instances of smuggling involving pre-designed or, you know, already manufactured ornaments and jewelry. So that's kind of where we're at. We're at this stage where we have all this information and we're still trying to learn how best to use it and how we can tweak it and get more from it and how we can partner with people to really, you know, bring it out and to verify it and to use it to really further the knowledge.
Very interesting. I mean, even this is just a pilot project, and the way the findings are emerging, it's a beginning to a very long journey that is going to be very insightful and perhaps very innovative in terms of coming up with ways of tackling this issue. In the same view, it reminds me of an act or an occurrence that I encountered while working in the Central African region that links small-scale poaching to the issue of arms, whereby individuals in communities, you find only two people maybe have hunting guns. And the community lives by hunting, gathering, and all these ways of survival, livelihoods, and challenging environments. Then the one who doesn't have the gun borrows from the one who has, goes to hunt, hunts a monkey, which is commonly called macaque in that region, and then sells that and buys his own gun. So you find wildlife funding new acquisition of weapons again. That is comparable to the fact that we might be looking at the bigger, highly threatened wildlife and forgetting the smaller ones. In the same perspective, we might be running after the bigger poacher and forgetting the demand down there. I think, Christopher, with your insights in terms of your current work, you could give us more perspectives in terms of linking the poacher, both the bigger poacher, the smaller poacher, and the society at large.
Sure. Well, there are a couple of different aspects that I've looked at in terms of poaching. And again, the Swan Survey has been very concerned with armed groups and armed conflict. And so, well, Nelson, what you're talking about and what you're touching on the dynamics of poaching in different regions are very different. What's going on next door in Kruger National Park, of course, is very different to what's going on in the DRC or in Cameroon or some of these other places where there have been very large elephant massacres over the last several years. And kind of as a segue and building off of what you're doing with some of your work, and particularly in looking at media data, this was kind of where my interest in what's going on in Kruger National Park had started. A couple of years ago, looking at like anybody else, the alarming increase of rhino poaching rates in Kruger National Park or across South Africa. And so for me, the interest was how are these rhinos being killed and what are they using to do that? And so, of course, with firearms, for media reports, it was possible for me from afar in my office in Nairobi. I was in Geneva at that time anyway. Some of the information was quite limited. The reports of Winchesters or Mausers or Czech-type hunting rifles being seized from poachers, many of them Mozambican. So from there, I was interested in where are these Mozambicans sourcing these types of weapons. Well, we can, with some great degree of confidence, be assured that those aren't being manufactured in Mozambique. So where are they coming from? It's possible to then look at the imports of hunting rifles into Mozambique. And so I was interested to look at a website, the UN Comtrade website, the UN Commodity Trading Statistics database. And from here, you can see the number of sporting and hunting rifle imports into Mozambique made by reporting exporting states. And so it's a list that includes the Czech Republic, it includes Portugal, it includes Brazil, and a number of other European states. Portugal and the Czech Republic being the most prominent of European exporters. But also, to a slightly lesser degree, you have the UK, Germany, Italy, France. China is also involved in exporting hunting rifles to Mozambique. And so one of those weapons, in particular the CZ550, it's a Czech manufactured hunting rifle, is reported to be a very popular type of firearm used by Mozambican poachers in Kruger National Park. So I was particularly interested in this type of weapon. And so what is really needed to further understand that? What is the method of trying to determine if in fact these weapons are coming from European exporters, if they are in fact coming from Mozambique? Well, there are a number of different ways to go about trying to do that. One of them is to look at the markings of firearms. Firearms markings it can be thought of somewhat analogous to human DNA. You send a sample into a lab, they run some tests, and voila, you've got 100,000 years of ancestry mapped out from the Rift Valley to wherever. Well, firearms are very similar, albeit on a much more condensed timeline. But firearms markings in an ideal setting can tell you who the manufacturer is of those firearms. They can tell you the exporter, the importer. For state-held weapons, there are markings, there are guidelines and regulations within different regions in Africa that provide these guidelines of how weapons should be marked if they're state-held weapons. So militaries, armies, police, they have a designated marking which should be on those weapons. Likewise, wildlife and custodial agencies should also have their own set of markings. And so it's possible then to see if these types of weapons are being used in poaching incidents to determine where they're being sourced. If they have these particular markings for state-held weapons, then you can determine that at one point anyway, if not presently, they are in the possession of a state security force. Likewise, serial numbers, of course, should be able to link those to private citizens. When a citizen purchases a weapon, goes through the registration process and receives a license, those serial numbers should be recorded into a centralized, readily accessible database, which could be accessed, again, if that weapon is to appear at a crime scene or to be used in poaching and seized from a poacher in any location in Africa. And so, looking again at the Comtrade data, and again looking at this list of exporting states, between the years of 2010 and 2015, where you have that increase of rhino poaching taking place in Kruger National Park, you have a startlingly similar rate of increase of hunting rifles into Mozambique. And so this was the point of interest, is trying to figure out what is, if there is one, the correlation between the increasing rate of hunting rifles into Mozambique and a corresponding increase of rhino poaching in Kruger National Park. I can't say with certainty that is happening, that those weapons are being imported and then going into Kruger National Park and being used to poach. But again, from those media reports, the CZ 550 hunting rifle. Winchesters are manufactured in Portugal, the Model 70, a very popular hunting rifle. And these other types are very likely coming from European states or some of these other exporting countries into Mozambique. And so it raises a number of issues. I mean, there's nothing, I should be clear, that there's nothing illegal about this export of weapons. I mean, it's being reported on a UN database. There's no reason to assume that there's something going on there. These states have every right to export these hunting rifles to Mozambique, of course. But there comes a question if we look at what has happened from December of 2014. And December 2014 is a significant point in terms of arms control globally, where you have coming into what is being enacted and what is coming into, been ratified in 2014, December 2014, is the Arms Trade Treaty. What is the Arms Trade Treaty? Well, the Arms Trade Treaty is another mechanism as part of the international regime of instruments to try to control illicit flows of weapons. And what the Arms Trade Treaty is quite explicit about is that exporting states should prevent the export of firearms where there's evidence to suggest that those firearms will be used to commit violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, be used in a general way to undermine peace and security, should be prevented if those weapons, if there's evidence to suggest they'll be used to conduct acts of terrorism. Most noteworthy, in Article 7 of the ATT, it also mentions transnational organized crime. And so here is where the glove fits, I think, in terms of firearms and their usage among Mozambican poachers or any other poacher who's coming from any other country in any context, of hunting rifle exports to African states. There is a responsibility there. The trade itself is legal, but there is a responsibility, particularly among those European states who are ratifying parties to the Arms Trade Treaty. And so looking again at those statistics from 2010 to 2015 and seeing this increase in imports and in rhino poaching, there's the list of those exporting states, and some of them are exporting quite significant levels, Portugal and the Czech Republic among them. And so, again, and Julian Rademeyer mentions this also in the first part of his two-part series, looking at rhino poaching with the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and that is the import of CZ 550s into Mozambique, where initially it appears that they are imported by the Department of Agriculture as a way for them to control elephant populations. But then another source saying that a significant number of those weapons are believed to be in the hands of poachers. And so what I'm interested in looking at are what are those links and what is that correlation if it does exist. And this is where weapons markings become very important, and looking at the types of weapons on the one hand, but looking a little bit beyond that and trying to actually do analysis work of the markings themselves to try to determine where in fact they're coming from, which years those weapons are being imported. All these things are very important to try to produce the evidence needed to take to the European Union in this case and perhaps have a re-examination of policies concerning the exportation of firearms to various states. And so this is some of the work that we're trying to do. This is the work that we've done in conflict areas, and so trying to adapt those similar methodologies into the context of poaching. So on one hand, we conduct a lot of trainings for journalists in helping journalists identify weapons, how to physically document ammunition, where you have head stamp data on the casings of bullets, or where you have markings on the barrel or the bolt carrier or the receiver of firearms, so that they themselves can piece together these various bits of information and make their own determinations of where these weapons might be coming from. The same principles can apply to training rangers, training police, or whoever else it is who is at the scene of these investigations taking place at poaching area kill sites, where you can document these types of things and then provide the analysis for the people who may have the expertise to provide that analysis of that data, to start mapping out these chains of custody, to start seeing where weapons are flowing into certain areas and where they're being used by poachers. And so through a longitudinal analysis of this data, in the more areas where you can draw a sample from poaching sites, then the better you can see within a certain country or a certain park or across borders in a more regional sense, where different types of ammunition or firearms are more popular, where there's a pattern in the usage of those types of things based upon arrest records or seizures and these types of things, but also then be privy to, in a timely way, identify new and emergent patterns within those ammunition and firearms that are being used by poachers. And so it's a very different context, and going back to the issue of some of the differences of poaching in Central African states, and take again, for example, Kruger National Park, where in Kruger the emphasis is what's very important are the hunting rifles, in looking at the markings and having a better understanding of where those weapons are coming from. In Central African states, where you have a number of armed groups who are participating in poaching activity, it's a different situation where they may be already flush with so many weapons that trying to make sense of where they're coming from is irrelevant. Some of these weapons, of course, AK pattern rifles have been around for decades, and so there's no point really in trying to get an understanding of where they've come from. But ammunition becomes much more important, and the ammunition casings where they have head stamps, and similar to firearms markings, head stamp data can tell you the manufacturer, the year of manufacture, the caliber of the bullet, and maybe a few other bits of information. And this becomes more important in the context of poaching in those areas, because there's a constant demand for this ammunition. It's constantly coming in where these armed groups, they may not need the weapons, and so there may not be as much trafficking activity going on there, but certainly the ammunition is what is needed. And some groups have done some very good work in looking at ammunition in some of these big poaching incidents in Central Africa, and have been able to trace that ammunition back to Sudan. And so you can see that there's something there which is worthy of investigation, trying to determine how the Sudanese government, because of course it manufactures its own ammunition, how that ammunition is finding its way into these areas of poaching across many Central African parks and conservancies and elsewhere. So there's a whole range of things, and we maybe in the Q&A can get into some of the details concerning what can happen at the state level, and trying to shore up some of those challenges and looking at diversion of weapons and so forth.
Yeah, no, thanks. Just to add on that, in terms of marking and record keeping of arms within the African continent, most of the African countries have actually espoused that approach as encouraged by the United Nations instruments. And the challenge remains at the national level, enforcement. In terms of, you mark weapons, yes, you have a database, but are you able to effectively trace a weapon that is in illicit possession back to the original owner? That's where the gap again occurs, and it's a weakness at the national level. But internationally, there are enough instruments, and challenges exist, yes, but they are surmountable in any case. We'll come back, I think, to the issue of the Kruger National Park and the issue of demand and supply perspectives. Tapua, you talked about research-based advocacy. As we said, in this session, we are basically looking at research-based evidence that supports our research. How do you go about your work in terms of your methodology? How do you deal with the situation on the ground?
The situation on the ground when it relates to dealing with poachers is very difficult to come up with what is really taking place. You only know about it after the animals have been killed, after the carcasses have been discovered. I'll give you the example that Kiara has talked about of the elephants. Actually, they were discovered by tourists who were actually using a helicopter going above Wange National Park. That's when they discovered that something is very unknown, is very unwell. That's when they discovered now, the challenge is, if you want to do media analysis, each and every media house will come up with its own number, its own figures. The Telegraph talk of about 1,000 elephants. The state media talks about 1,000 elephants, but they are saying this stretches from 2000 to 2014. Private media talks about 300 elephants. So you all have these numbers, statistics being scattered around. So it's up to you as a judge to go on the ground and try to ask the rangers themselves what actually transpired and how much or how many they have counted. It's very difficult to come up with an actual number, but it's always good to triangulate and you come up with an average number. So when we have got that, probably the media is the most powerful entity when it comes to the issue of advocacy. Because once it gets out there, it creates a lot of noise. We can talk of the issue of Sisu the lion. I think everyone else has heard about it. The issue of Sisu the lion actually brought about a very complex scenario whereby people masquerade as trophy hunters actually aiding to illegal trade. We've got a case in Thailand, Bangkok, whereby those who are involved in wildlife hunting actually use prostitutes who masquerade as trophy hunters. That's how innovative the illegal traffickers are. So it's up to our state agencies and everyone else involved to become innovative as well. Some people are talking of tracking where the money is. Some people are talking of cutting the demand, which is very difficult because whenever there's money, if you're talking of issues of bribery, the illegal wildlife trade is also similar to the drug dealing, whereby as long as we have got the market that is willing to pay, it's going to be very difficult to stop it. It takes willing, and it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous in the sense that no one wants to be associated or to be discovered when it comes to these issues. We also, regarding the elephants, some poaching that normally take place, those who get caught are people who actually done the dirty work. The smugglers, the financiers, and everyone else remain anonymous. So I think it's a cause for concern whereby, where do these guys get the rifles? You look at a local village boy, it's very difficult for him to have access to an AK-47. It's very difficult for this young man, at least under the age of 21, to have a bucket full of cyanide and have access into Wange National Park to go and poison a pond, which is deep down in the middle of what? Or of an animal habitat. Also, this also raises questions on the research that was done by the Oxford Wildlife Research Unit, whereby they ask animals that has been confiscated, probably a sheep has been confiscated on its way probably to Asia. are we able to trace where these animals are coming from? Because this is the middle of the sea. Now they've been confiscated. What is the fate of these animals? Do they go back to their own habitat? Will they be kept in captive? Or they are actually retaken back into the illegal wildlife trade? I think these are the complexities that are involved when we are dealing with illegal wildlife trade. And if they are kept in captivity, I think the way the wild now needs to be removed, because it's no longer their wild habitat that we are talking about. So this whole issue is very complicated. It's very complicated. I mean, we need to keep trying when it comes to issues of advocacy. That's why everyone else is in here, so that probably will come up with a common cause for concern on how to stop this.
Still on advocacy, Kapua, we know that poachers come from the communities that we live in.
Mm-hmm.
They are part of us.
Mm-hmm.
They are part of the society.
Yes.
And the society knows quite a lot about how poachers go about their business. Some of them are their own parents or grandparents or whichever, uncles. How do you work with the community to ensure that you have access to information beforehand? Because instead of being reactive by seeing already the carcasses, how would you ensure that you are proactive? Have you thought about that approach?
Yes, the initial strategy that started was we were working within the impact of coal mining, and it is the community that actually came up with. We can talk of the pollution, we can talk of the dust that is coming, and we can talk of the forced removals, but we are forgetting the very crucial part of animal habitat being destroyed and the animals being scattered all over the place. You see, poaching is a poverty-driven activity. It's very difficult, and in Zimbabwe, I mean, being a poacher, you can be killed. So nobody wants to be involved in such a dangerous, but it's a poverty-driven activity. So when you want to get information on poaching from the community are very closed entities. They really know the poachers very well, and some people are well known for their poaching. So if you interview like the other guy that we interviewed, because they want to remain anonymous, it was very, very sad that he's linked to some of the political elites. We will talk of militarization of this whole thing. That's how complex it becomes. People who are supposed to protect the animals are the one involved. Most countries in mainland Africa are landlocked. And when they are landlocked and their products or poaching products are found in Asia, it's either they use the air or the coasts. So it means there is a route that somebody is failing to monitor, or somebody that is failing to. So it involves the immigration department, the police, the park rangers, people with power. That's how complex it is. So what I've discovered is we can talk of these young men and women involved in the actual killing and actually monitoring of, but as long as we don't deal with the powers that be, we are fighting a lost battle. It's one step forward and two steps backwards.
It's a very interesting point, because it ties very closely with the Kira's finding that most of the studies tend to focus more on the source of the wildlife, that is the African countries per se, and very limited research has focused on the demand on the other side. Kira, can you take us a bit through that in terms of socio-economic aspects of the demand factor?
Yeah, I think in trying to understand the broader picture of all of this for the context of the research we're doing, you hear a lot of the generalizations or possibly myths around what the use of certain products are, like rhino horn elsewhere. And we know generally that just by looking at smuggling data that the largest markets are in China and Vietnam, and that we know that's where the lucrative industry is probably really headed. But what is the actual dynamics, or what is the nuance in some of the demand dynamics? Is it really, what percentage, let's say, of communities are using it for traditional medicine versus it as a luxury good? And are there differences between a rhino horn when it's shaved versus when it's raw from the root? Does that have different connotations and values in these Asian countries? That matters for other things that are going on when it comes to the trade of rhino horn. And I think what we need more of, and possibly we can get at it through the media monitoring, if we can have more Chinese and Vietnamese language skills to help us kind of unpack what the media is focusing on in Asia, and possibly explore more of the research happening in these countries, researchers themselves, academics in Chinese universities and Vietnamese universities, and who are really looking at what is the nature of the demand. Do we really understand it? Do we know the scale so that we can understand the volume that is required to be sourced from Africa? And then do we also know, can we stop using such generalizations around the uses of these products and actually know what are the differences? I know there's limited studies that do that, and they're showing there's a difference between the cities in China and the rural areas. We know that in our larger cities like Beijing, Shanghai, a lot of Chinese people would say they wouldn't touch rhino horn because they know it has a conservation effect, and that they also don't believe in Chinese medicine or its uses. Then that can contrast to something that we're seeing in the data on the countryside. And I think that that's important in this context, so that we move away from broad generalizations or very easy narratives that help us kind of make this the problem of the other. And I think that's important in this context, is that even in the context of, we hear a lot about Mozambique, and I think that's important, obviously, and I think it's a big question, but our research really saw that the largest number of actors, or the perpetrators in this case, were South African, followed by Chinese, followed by Mozambican. So I think that's a really important discussion as well, is what are the big narratives that are held in this space by NGOs, by all the different people that are active in this, and so that's why we're calling for kind of more of research into demand, so that we can get Asian voices into this, because it's a two-way. We're talking about supply, Africa supplies the market, but what about the demand? And I really think that's missing, and we'd like to see much more research in that space.
That's very interesting. I think the demand factor becomes a very important player in this whole context. Christopher, in your view, in terms of the hunting rifles going into Mozambique and finding their way perhaps into the Kruger National Park and being misused, if we are to tackle the demand at this end of the graph and the supply from that end of the Western countries that are supplying these weapons legitimately, they're being exported in Mozambique, how would we go about this in your own recommendations?
Well, I think that again, the evidence needs to be presented and pieced together. In this particular case, it's necessary to look very closely at the individual weapons which are being seized from Mozambican poachers, or again, in any context. I don't mean to just focus attention only on Mozambique, to determine if in fact, these weapons are being used to commit transnational organized crime. Then it would seem to me that, especially for those states which are party to the Arms Trade Treaty, that there would be an increased level of scrutiny on those exports, to at least begin to determine what is going on domestically, where those weapons are being used in illegal hunting or poaching, so that there are some guarantees made, or at least to the extent possible, that those importing states can demonstrate or begin to demonstrate a willingness to strengthen whatever it is that is allowing for those weapons to end up in a place like Kruger National Park. But it's also important to, there are two things I guess I'd add to that. One is the importance of partnerships for organizations like my own or ISS, others who kind of have the perspective on the security side of all this, but also those who are heavily involved in the conservation of these areas, in trying to share data and trying to share information and knowledge about how these dynamics are really at play, whether it's the demand for weapons or the demand for wildlife. What are the trafficking routes? Who are the traffickers? Because a lot of these things, the same people are involved, and they're similar actors, whether it's drugs, it's people, it's wildlife, it's firearms. What are those intersections where these are coming together and where these criminals are participating and have their hands in many different pots in terms of the things that are being illicitly trafficked? And so I think that also there's a lot to be done at national levels in a number of places in looking at this, and looking at particularly law enforcement. I think is a big issue, which is of course a concern on the wildlife side, but also on the firearms side as well, and how to control the illicit nature of flow and demand and a number of other dynamics that are at play.
Given this dynamic between South Africa and Mozambique concerning the Kruger, have you in your own research picked up any trends that are transnational to nature?
Wildlife trade, or let me call it wildlife illegal trade, is very transnational in nature. The challenge with transnational boundaries, animals move willy-nilly across borders. And normally poachers target the easier side. So already we now have a challenge whereby poachers don't go where they can be easily caught, they can go where they can easily get the animals without any challenges. That comes in the issue of that Chris has been talking about, whereby somebody can easily access arms. In Zimbabwe, it's a bit difficult to access arms. That's why you see these guys are now using cyanide. So the government is very strict. I mean, being caught with a rifle in Zimbabwe is something that can tantamount you to probably a life imprisonment. But that doesn't stop the poaching. They've actually come up with a more innovative and a more destructive, a gruesome way of killing. So whenever we've managed to curtail a certain way, they actually come up with a more innovative way, which can be very destructive. So when you talk of transboundary, the poaching exercises themselves, they are transboundary. As long as you are closer to the coast, the easier it is for them to kill the animals and actually put them on the boat and they go to their own destination. The issue is, I think we need to focus more on the demand side. This is simple economics. Whenever the demand is high, the price goes up. Because when we talk of the Rhino ones, we are talking of something between 20,000 to 65,000 per kilogram. So when the demand is a bit low, it means the price shift from probably 35,000 going back as to low as $4,000. When there's actually no demand, it means nobody will kill the rhinos for their horns. So I think we need to focus more on the demand side, because it's the demand which actually precipitated the killing of this trade. And it's not animals. It's not animals like rhino that are being traded. We're talking of the pangolin. They talk of the scales being transported to Asia. I think from a recent paper that I was reading, I think it was in Thailand or Bangkok. I forgot where immigration or the Department of Immigration caught scales 8.8 tons, and you know how small the pangolin is, and we are talking of 8.8 tons of pangolin scales, and we wonder how many animals died to come out with 8.8 tons. And the method of killing, I don't think anyone would need to shoot a pangolin. It's quite small for you to use a rifle. So there are other methods of killing that we actually not thinking about, but which are actually precipitating the trade. And at what point will you come up with 8.8 tons? It means they are stored somewhere. There's an element of storage now. Where are these animals being stored? Obviously, they are stored in one end of this country, especially when talking of Southern Africa, we're talking of Mozambique, Zimbabwe, but probably those at the coast, because it's very difficult to use cargo planes. It's normally ships. Where are these animals being stored before they get to Asia? I think Asia is the furthest distance from the Cape or the Beira or Namibia, but they are reaching there. So it's a very complex network that is involved.
I think as researchers are in for a long haul in terms of these.
Some of the what you can do is probably get involved in the trade to see exactly what transpires. But it's a very dangerous game, I tell you.
It reminds me Ambassador's speech in which he talked about an ambiguity of legislation. Would it be that, and this is a general question to the panelists, is there a need to standardize cross-border legislation in terms of some of these wildlife crimes so that you deter potential criminals from taking advantage of one side of the border where the legislation is less tight? Or should countries just restrict themselves on the intra-approach to the issue?
Maybe let me start by responding to that. It's not about standardizing policies or laws. It's about enforcing. It's enforcement. As long as we've got a law that is standardized and it's being enforced by all nationalities or by all nations, it's easier. The reason why people go to Mozambique instead of South Africa, it doesn't mean that Mozambique doesn't have laws. It has laws, but it's the enforcement aspect that is challenging. And another point that I've mentioned earlier, the militarization of this wildlife trade. Those who are supposed to protect the game rangers and the rest are involved in such activities. So it becomes difficult to talk of legislation in itself is quite irrelevant, but it's the enforcement part which is strategic. That's how they see it.
Yeah, and I would say it would be interesting to we would like to track changes of legislation and implementation over time, and then look at the data on poaching and see if we can match or show any reaction to poaching through changing legislation or approaches. It would be a hard thing to do. We'd have to try to find a measure for the legislation itself. That could be fine. You could track dates of when laws are implemented, but then it's the actual implementation of those laws. When did we start to see a change? What would be our measures, our variables there to actually track when things began to change, and if that started to affect in the nature of poaching and smuggling. We could try that with the look of when cyanide poisoning began. Was that in reaction to types of legislation and implementation? At what side? Is it internationally and something to do around arms? Is it domestic? I think that would be a really interesting area to to unpack that question and try to look at the statistics on incidents next to legislation and implementation.
Christopher, just on the issue of arms, because I can imagine a poacher without a gun wrestling down a rhino. I mean, approach a rhino with your bare hands and aim at extracting the horn. How would that look like? How come the issue for the AK-47, which is the most widespread weapon on the continent, is not a weapon of choice in the case of Kruger National Park? It's an interesting phenomenon. Have you picked up anything of that kind?
Well, I think it is actually a part of the poaching. The teams of poachers that are going into Kruger National Park. There have been reports of having kind of a defensive perimeter around the main shooter with the hunting rifle. This protective element armed with AK pattern rifles. Mm-hmm. Obviously, AK-47 doesn't have the stopping power of a hunting rifle in killing big game, and so it doesn't make sense in that way to cause such a ruckus with so many shots needed to be fired, I guess, to kill that type of animal. But certainly in some of to go back to Central Africa, it has been a very effective weapon. Elephants naturally congregate in herds, and so with AK-47s, you can shoot many bullets at a lot of different animals, and I've heard the term spray and pray, and just kind of hope that some of them fall, and so there's that method as well. Obviously, AK-47s are much less expensive than hunting rifles. The ammunition is also much less expensive. Some 20 cents for a cartridge for an AK-type firearm. Much more expensive, $10 to $20 for a single round of a hunting rifle. So there's an economical issue as well, and some of the issues brought up in Zimbabwe in terms of the expense. A lot of subsistence poachers relying upon silent forms of killing animals. So there's that other factor of not bringing too much attention to yourself by having loud weapons and lots of gunfire and these types of things, where of course you're now seeing accessorized hunting rifles with sound suppressors and these sorts of things, perhaps becoming more common in some of these areas.
Well, I think at this juncture it would be interesting to hear just a few words from each one of you in terms of some of the innovative approaches you will be taking in following up on your research so far. How do you intend to carry forward your research? What are some of the objectives you intend to achieve with the initiative? 1 minute each.
Okay, I'll go. For our purposes, we really did a thorough review of the pilot phase, which ran from January until June of this year, and we made tweaks to the methodology so that we can better get at the wildlife topic. But then we've also taken on a new subject of drugs in Southern Africa and East Africa. So now that's what our researchers are now focusing on, and we're getting some really interesting results. So they're mapping out both instances that are, let's say, a bust of something just related to narcotics or wildlife, and we also code when those are together. So that's showing some interesting findings, because really what this tool is aimed at is going beyond the question of wildlife crime. That was just our pilot focus, because for two reasons. It's a massive challenge in the region, and also the media covers it well. So we kind of use that as a for our experiment, so to speak. But it's going to get more complicated as we move into other forms of organized crime. But in East Africa, we're finding there's a lot of coverage of drug issues, and that's been interesting and raises new questions for us about how do we code different levels of possession, small to large, these kind of things. And then when we move into North Africa, we want to start looking at the media analysis or discussion around human and migrant smuggling and how that compares and what we've learned in the South. So it's really putting a lot of pressure on the media, or putting a lot of weight on the media. And so it's important that we say that, we really, I think you brought it up, Christopher, journalist training and the investigative capacity of journalists is really important, we think, in the African context to understand transnational organized crime. And it's one of our best tools, and we have to try to strengthen it. And so that's what we're hoping to do, similar trainings and engagement with the media to really help in that space, because it's one of the key things, it's one of the key ways we know about organized crime, is that, and journalists really have to grapple with that. And so, the project is growing and growing. So.
Interesting, thanks. Christopher, how are you taking it?
Well, obviously, poaching is a very sensitive topic for any government. And so when you add on top of that firearms and illicit firearms, it can become even more sensitive. And so for us, it's very important to continue to develop partnerships with governments and encourage their willingness to be a part of this type of work and looking at illicit weapons flows. Because obviously the consequences of the outcomes of that work can be very sensitive for those governments. I mean, if you look at ammunition alone, you can almost draw a line of manufacturing states from Egypt all the way to South Africa. Egypt, Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zimbabwe at one point was manufacturing ammunition. I'm not sure if they are anymore. And South Africa, of course. And so this data potentially will point back to some level of locally sourced ammunition, let's say, in those parks or conservancies where this poaching is taking place in those countries that are manufacturing either weapons in some cases or the ammunition which is being used to kill this wildlife. So government willingness and participation and partnership and getting buy-in from governments is extremely important for any of this really to make any difference. And so, in of course, the civil society partnerships, it's equally as important. But trying to actually look at the cause, the source of many of these illicit weapons and ammunition, it's essential that governments be a part of that.
Atapu, how are you moving forward?
Yeah, I think what my colleagues have just said is very essential, especially when it comes to government buy-in. It's always difficult to have a buy-in from the government for some of these issues. But also journalism training in terms of wildlife and how they need to report on such. Because when you look at journalism, you need to have somebody with skills to report on all this. I think also it's all to do with partnerships. They always say there's an African proverb which says that in times of trouble or crisis, it's always good to build bridges than dams. So I think it's time we build bridges, so that this is a transboundary issue. It's an African issue, it's an international issue. I think we need to share knowledge on all this so that we can come up with a holistic approach that can actually solve or reduce. Because we are talking of in Zimbabwe in the early 80s, the rhino population was about 2,000, but right now we are talking of less than 600. And looking at the way the reproduction of rhinos, it only takes not less than 18 months. So the rate at which they are dying and the rate at which they reproduce, there is a gap. So it's time that people or other like-minded stakeholders take action. Because looking at the next 20 years, we won't be having any rhinos left.
Yeah, and I just want to bounce off the idea of sharing and collaborating. Something I always say is, there's so much data out there, and people sit on it, and it's about sensitivity and about security, and there's ways around that. There's ways we can strip data down, and remove all the names mentioned. Share it with researchers like us. Let us help in these efforts, because we're all sitting on pockets of data, and if we started to collaborate more, we could get a lot further in this and start to connect the dots. So that's something I always encourage is, if you want to know what that means or what it looks like, there's loads of options, but sitting on data doesn't help us advance any of this. So.
Thanks. I think this is the beginning of that knowledge sharing, cross-border interaction at a more research-based approach. Before we come to the closing of this formal session, because the Q&A session will be under Chattanam rules and therefore will be off air, I would like to invite our guest, the ambassador, just to say a word or two, maybe if he has something to say.
Okay, many thanks. Maybe 2 or 3 points. First of all, listening to that discussion again makes me happy and proud that we are associated in underpinning a lot of that research and that effort. Some of the examples you were sharing led me also to think that hopefully this not only would lead to increased advocacy, but also more propensity of the public for outcry. And we have lost, I think, track of being scandalized, be it by a local embassy involved in smuggling. It just makes a small footnote somewhere, but not really a big issue of scandalized advocacy. And I think also to take the discussion beyond the Rhino only, but focus on the sort of pangolins and other aspects, I think would again help to regenerate the global interest in these sort of phenomena. Just coming here, I was listening to the radio that in the US that was facilitating the ease of access to arms, which also sort of led me to come back to my earlier point, is that as European Union, in trying to improve governance around all of these issues, we're increasingly on our own in terms of that. But hopefully also being able to team up with Africa more prominently, also for the absence of other bigger actors, and so that the African Union, but also hopefully South Africa, SADC, etc., remains an entry point where we should sort of capitalize more on. And then, of course, it was, I think, a fair point to bring in the demand side of the equation, and there was referred back to last year when we, of course, were involved with the CITES conference and the difficult issue of sustainable trophy hunting as part of channeling some of the demand away from the legal activities to legal and controllable aspects. And this is also part of the equation where I must say we had at the time worked very well with South Africa to find, I think, a sustainable way forward to circumscribe that particular issue. So all of that, thanks a lot. For me, that was a fabulous sort of morning. Thanks for a very good moderation and the privilege to listen to some very learned experience here in the field. Thanks.
Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, just before we go into the Q&A session, I'd just like a small token of our gratitude. It's my very, very sincere hope that our grandchildren are able to see the real thing, and with your support, we hope to inform the debate that makes that happen. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Wow, this is quite amazing. Yeah. But I hope the real thing will survive. Yeah, no, but thanks a lot. Well, this is great.